Let's begin this discussion with introductions of our esteemed panelists. Phil Zuckerman is professor of sociology at Pitzer College. He's been described by his students as brilliant, engaging, lovable, and hilarious. Did you know that?
I get called that by my wife every day.
After spending time in Scandinavia, his academic career has revolved around understanding the implications of a society built upon a secular foundation. More specifically, Phil has elegantly and lucidly cataloged the discrepancies that exist between highly theological nations and those that remain impassive to dogmatic notions of religiosity. Combining his fresh colloquial style and survey data, he reminds us that leading one's faith is a complex, drawn-out process. And rather than the cliches of nihilistic atheists, apostates are life-affirming, courageous, exceptionally perceptive, and deeply moral. His admonition: the sooner we recognize how freely and frequently men and women reject their doctrines, the sooner our understanding of the human condition will improve. He writes regularly for the Huffington Post and Psychology Today, illuminating and refining the nuances of secular thought. So thank you, Phil, for coming out and joining us today. So Angela Cardinale, you pronounce it like that, has been an invaluable English professor and mentor to her students for 9 years. She earned her MFA in creative writing from Columbia University, and her essays have been published in the Chaffey Review, the Mojave River Review, and in the anthology Lost Found Stories from New York. Currently, she's the advisor for the Chaffey College Club of Secular Understanding, and she seeks to help students find their voices so they have a safe environment in which to freely explore ideas, especially progressive ones, like those we'll be discussing tonight. Professor Ryan Falcioni is professor of philosophy at Chaffey College. He completed his PhD in philosophy of religion and theology from Claremont Graduate University in 2011. He specializes in 20th century philosophy of religion, cultural theory, and philosophy of language. Currently, his research centers on the philosophical and ethical connections between religion, atheism, and secularism. He has contributed book chapters to the recent volumes Religion and the New Atheism and Skeptical Faith. Ryan has recently given lectures on philosophical theism, atheism, and secularism at the University of Kansas, UCLA, and other local universities. He will on sabbatical next year and plans on serving as a visiting scholar at the Institute for Social Ethics at the University of Zurich in Switzerland, where he'll be writing and lecturing on religious and secular ethical systems. Alexis. Yeah, I know we didn't clap for Angela. Okay. Alexis Eklund is a double major in sociology and secular studies at Pitzer College. She'll be finishing her BA in the spring of 2015. Upon completion, Alexis will be the first woman to graduate with a degree in secular studies in the United States. As a young Jehovah's Witness, Alexis proselytized from household to household, but she herself was devoid of religious conviction. Contrary to what her upbringing would suggest, she later found herself enamored with the question, what makes people irreligious? In pursuit of answering that query, she turned to the social sciences. Currently, she's involved with the Riverside Atheists and Free Thinkers and serves as the community representative for the Secular Student Alliance at the Claremont Colleges. So thank you, Alexis. So I don't know why we didn't mention that Alexis also was a Chaffey College student before she transferred to Pitzer, and that should have been in the intro. I know. So you guys can all consider transferring to Pitzer next. So let's start with a question for Phil, and I only have one question, so the rest of you I know have a lot of questions, and we'll just kind of move on to those discussions. So I was reading Society Without God, and I absolutely fell in love with your phrase about Denmark and Sweden, where belief in God is muted, minimal, and marginal. So I kind of feel like anytime I can, I'm going to throw out those words, muted, minimal, and marginal. What has been your experience in the classroom, specifically when you teach, when students actually absorb, and maybe some of them come in with this already, but I know a lot of my students don't, where they absorb the idea that a moral society can and does actually currently exist without reliance on a fear of God?
Okay, well thank you for having me, and thanks for the introduction, and thanks for the question. There's a lot of people standing. I see like 2 chairs over there, maybe. Are there any other chairs? I feel bad for all the people standing. I think there's a chair here, maybe. Oh well, that's it. Well, let me see how to answer that. Basically, the notion that society will fall apart if it's not grounded in a belief in God, it goes back to the Bible, right? The prophets are always blaming all the problems. Like, if things go bad for the Israelites, the prophets are always like, well, you stopped worshiping God, or worse, you worshiped a female goddess or something, and that's why we're being slaughtered or eaten by a plague or something, and you need to get back to worshiping God or everything will fall apart. So you find such sentiments in the Quran that, without belief in God, things go awry, and there can be no moral society. And that's all the way up to Newt Gingrich, right, who, after the slaughter of children in Sandy Hook, said, well, this is the result of secularism. This is what happens when there's secularism in society. People go amok and kill each other. So it's a deep, deep association. So basically, to me, what I found about it, and maybe it's because I'm in sociology, but I won't go on here. I'm just setting this up. We can test it. We can, do societies that don't have strong belief in God fall apart? Are societies that are very strong in their belief in God doing really well? Like, let's go look. We've got an independent variable, strength of worship and belief in God, and a dependent variable. How's the society doing? Is there a lot of murder, a lot of crime, a lot of poverty, a lot of illness, lack of education, all that stuff? So let's just look and see. So what I did was I compared all the countries that, in terms of how strong their faith in God is, how strong their worship of God is, and you can rank them. It's not exact. It's sociology. It's a soft science, fuzzy, but you get a clear sense, and many studies agree. And you can look at the least religious countries in the world and the most religious countries in the world, and then just see how they're doing on like 50 different indicators of societal well-being. You can look at healthcare outcomes, infant mortality. You can look at political freedoms, freedom of speech. You can look at murder rates. You can look at peacefulness, etc., etc., etc. The correlation is very strong that the least religious societies today are doing the best in terms of social well-being, and the most religious societies today are doing the worst. Now, it's just a correlation. I'm not saying it causes it, but it at least debunks the thesis that without religion, society will fall apart. That we can falsify. We don't know what, we can, and then, just for fun, I did the same thing for the 50 states. You can rank the 50 states, and Pew Research has great data on how strongly people believe in God, how much they pray, how often they go to church. But I just focus on God belief, because you all know we can go to church and not believe, right? So I really wanted to get at theism, And so the 10 most religious states in the country are faring the worst on average in terms of homicide, poverty, domestic violence, child abuse, unemployment, you name it. And the 10 least religious states in this country generally are faring the best on all these measures. So the correlation holds at the global level, and the correlation holds here within the United States. So the question was, so I went to Scandinavia, which has the lowest rates of belief in God, among the lowest. Czech Republic's pretty low as well, other countries as well, South Korea, Japan. But I went to Scandinavia, at least in the Western world, and I lived there for 2 years actually, and wrote a book about how, they have the lowest violent crime rates, the lowest murder rates, the best welfare systems, the greatest rights for women, you name it. And I can give you a lot of anecdotes and stories about that and facts. So the question was, how do students take this? Well, it depends where I'm teaching. So when I'm in Scandinavia, my students at the University of Aarhus were like, duh. Like, it was like, what, and whoever said, I said, well, my research shows that you don't have to have religion to have a good society. And they're like, whoever said that? It's so not a part of their worldview. They do not equate morality with religiosity at all. These things are totally different. And your average Scandinavian, of course, morality is that you can be religious and do all kinds of horrible things, and you can be an atheist and be a wonderful. There's no correlation. So in their mind, it was like not even an interesting argument. It was so beyond that, in fact, somebody read my book, a Dane read my book and said, this book, which was about Scandinavia, said, this book is more about America than Scandinavia. And I said, well, why? He goes, the fact that you even wrote it and had to make the argument says a lot more about American sensibility than Scandinavians. And so when I'm at Pitzer College, most students also are like, duh. Pitzer's one of the most secular campuses in America. Most students there do not make the argument that we need religion for a secular society. So for them, it's just kind of interesting data. They even like to be skeptical of it and always remind me that correlation isn't causation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But when I'm at other campuses, when I'm speaking at Cal State Bakersfield, Cal State Fresno, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, I get a lot of pushback people are either angry about what I'm saying, or they knowingly smile and say, that may well be good and fine, but they're still going to hell. So that's kind of, those are the, so some people will say, well, what measures were you using? And and they want to scrutinize my data, which is great. I love scrutiny, I love skepticism. It's at the heart of being secular. But a lot of people, a lot of religious people generally will say, yeah, maybe they're doing fine on these sociological indicators, Phil, but they're still going to hell, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's sort of generally how it gets received. And I hope I answered the question.
Yes, you did, and we'll come back to some thoughts on that
good.
too. So speaking of going to hell, Angela, some of us have seen your Ask an Atheist. I know it's not really yours, but your club's Ask an Atheist booth around. And I was wondering if you feel like there's an antagonism toward the concept of being an atheist here on this campus.
So the club that I advise, which is the president's Billy, and I would say that they pretty much, I want to give them credit for all the work that they do because I'm just the advisor, but they every other week hold the Ask an Atheist booth in the quad, and it's basically just a place where people can come and find real live atheists and ask them questions about what it means to be an atheist, rather than, I think there's a lot of assumptions about what it means, that you hate babies and want to hurt people, or I don't know, there's lots of negative connotations with the word atheist. And either that or there's a lot of dismissiveness. So either there's anger or there's dismissiveness, like you don't even matter. I know Billy's experienced people just coming up to the booth and sighing loudly, like shh, and then walking away, like not even asking questions. So the goal is to just sort of be there every other week so that it sort of demystifies what it is to be an atheist. And the students have set it up so that it's not meant to be confrontational in any way. It's not meant to like convert people to atheism, whatever that means, or to, I don't know, to even question or interrogate people about their beliefs. It's meant to sort of just be an informational type thing that's not, I guess it's not supposed to be controversial. People do get angry. There was a person in the first booth for the semester that got into a pretty heated debate. And then he came back and had written up like 12 pages of counter arguments the following time it was there and presented the club with it. And so, I mean, that's a lot of effort, so I give him credit for that, I guess. But it didn't, I guess it sort of was beside the point. So, there's that. There's also a colleague that had mentioned, well, I don't know why that booth exists. They're just going to go to hell. So a colleague that I work with here said that to a classroom full of students, which I find really problematic. I think at a college, one of the goals here is to sort of not to change your values, but to question your values and sort of compare them with the values of others around you. That's part of the educational process. And maybe that ultimately reaffirms what you already believe, or maybe it makes you change your ideas. Either one's fine with me, but I think that we should be an open forum for discussion. And so I think that anyone that tries to change that or limit that discussion, really, that's what bothers me, especially being at a public college. So I think that's kind of what we experienced. I don't know. I think there has been some positive discussions too. But I think that people, it's hard when your beliefs and things that you dearly hold and you grew up with and you accept as truth or challenge in any way, that can feel uncomfortable for people. I think ultimately, if you feel secure in your beliefs, that shouldn't be a problem. You should be able, if you're secure in your beliefs, you should be able to kind of test them against those of others and come to your own conclusions and not be scared or worried there.
So Ryan, I know that one of the courses you teach here is on monotheistic religions. And I was wondering, for many secularists, they often miss the experience of actually even being in services at all. They may not know they missed that, but what are some of the things that secularists may miss out on that are actually of value that people who worship actually get to experience?
So sort of lessons or practices that religionists engage in or have that secularists don't or might struggle with or something, or that they can benefit from?
Yeah, that we could maybe even...
coming together.
Yeah, okay.
I'm
trying here.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm just starting to think about that.
I know I changed the question on you.
Yeah, it's close enough. I think that there are a few things that are at least lessons to be learned or gleaned from traditional religious practice. Sam Harris just wrote a book, I think it came out last week before, talking about religious ritual, mostly meditation, kind of Eastern practices that he thinks are just beneficial at the level of neuroscience, social psychology, emotional development and health, and I think there's tons of stuff there, just the acts of meditation, whether it's prayer, whether it's Zen, I think can be amazingly beneficial for physical health, emotional health, and if that's seen through a spiritual lens, I think that's fine. But I think many of those things are just practical disciplines that are valuable no matter who's doing them. But that said, I think there are unique things if I'm really pushing it. I mean, I admire the discipline and devotion of certain ritual acts in traditional religion. I don't see many secularists doing them. I don't know that they're at fault for not doing so or missing out on something essential in the human experience, but like, I advise the Muslim Student Association here, MSA, and we were actually talking about this recently, just praying 5 times a day and what that means, and we had a little workshop on it. And I was actually talking to a Christian group about it, and they said a similar question, like, sort of, what's something we can learn from, or, well, they didn't ask it that way, actually, but it was, what are some things that Islam does you think are sort of interesting? And I said, well, I think just, structuring your life around ritual acts, and waking up to pray, not praying in your car when you have a little bit of time, or before meals, but structuring your daily life as with a blueprint around, reflection, meditation, thinking about these bigger ethical and even spiritual issues. And I think that that's something that's hard to find a space for in secularism, and I think it's kind of can be villainized in some ways. That's too extreme, or it's a waste of time. And I think just the act of devotion, selfless devotion, just to another cause. I think it can be done through secular humanism or through secular modes. I think meditation can be one way of doing that, but the discipline, the fervency.
Like something like Lent.
Yeah, I don't think most Catholics take Lent that seriously, but we have Rosh Hashanah coming up here in 2 days, and I think those that take that seriously and see this 10 days of teshuvah, 10 days of repentance, and live that out, like that's pretty powerful. That 10 days where you're getting right with those that you've wronged, you're writing letters, you're taking people out to dinner, you're apologizing, and it's very this worldly, and that's one of the key features of secularism. It's very horizontal. It's not praying to God forgive me. It's doing forgiveness, meeting up with those you've wronged and getting right by them. And I think that's, High Holy Days are a prime example of a this worldly religious ritual that can be engaged with in secular ways. Or even in religious ways. And there's also the species of secularism that still engages with these acts of the religious. And I think that's okay. Now, it's hard to do that in a genuine way without bastardizing or alienating one or the other. And I think that's the difficulty, navigating kind of that secular religious hybridity, which is something you see in secular Judaism. You see it in certain areas of secular, more progressive Christianity. Unitarian Universalists, I think, often straddle that boundary of, we're Christian, but we don't believe in Christian theology, but we do, these things. So there are ways of doing that. So those are a couple examples. I don't know. Yeah, maybe the question I've pondered is there something unique about it? So there's something that cannot be captured without a certain religious sensibility. In other words, if everyone's completely secular, by this definition of secularism, meaning having no interest in religiosity and religious beliefs or claims or practices, would argue missing. Like, in other words, our Danes who, and by the way, many still are very culturally religious. They want to get married in church, don't buy into the theology of it, but buy into the fantasy of it, right? The story, the fairy tale type thing. And so is there something that's missing from that experience in a perfectly secular world, right? Does religion give us unique goods or unique insights into ritual or humanity? I don't know. I want to say and grant the autonomy of those practices in religion and say something like the 10 days of teshuvah in Judaism, is a uniquely Jewish practice, and I think it can be learned from by secularists, and versions of that can happen, but there might be something unique about the religious sensibility involved in there, and even seeing this broader cosmological picture of what forgiveness amounts to. It's completely this worldly, maybe, people are missing something. But the bottom line is I don't see any necessity either way. I don't think it has to be that way, or there's like this vacuum in all of our lives if we don't engage in religious ritual and teaching and so forth. Clearly, as Phil's research shows, in morality or in social structure, I don't think there's anything essentially missing or that we have to learn something from religion. But in ritual, I don't know. I think there's a lot of power there that isn't necessarily dangerous or, secularists should be afraid of, or anything we can learn from religion. And same thing with the way. I think religionists should be able to learn from secularists. Certain things about community and about values and about moral autonomy and about critical thinking. And it goes both ways. I think the danger is in balkanizing that discussion and saying, right, religionists over here, secularists over here, we have nothing to learn from each other, we're polar opposites on every possible measure. That's absurd. So I think religionists should be open to learning from secularists and vice versa. How those discussions go can be pretty messy. I've been a part of some of them, but I think it's possible.
Great, thank you very much. Alexis, So I know you have a dual major, and I'm assuming that you didn't choose secular studies as a lucrative means to your future career. I'm just guessing. I don't really know that for sure. But in any case, how has it informed your course of study and what you intend to do upon graduation?
Okay, well, you're right. I didn't choose secular studies because I thought it was going to make me rich. In fact, it might hurt me someday. We'll see. Hopefully not. But I started my academic career here, and I was interested in a lot of different things, but all of them were basically around human behavior. I decided to major in anthropology, and I was really frustrated with so many of the conversations that I had that had some type of assumption of a creator, goal-oriented evolution, this religious privilege that we should give because it's so closely tied to an ingrained in cultures. It was very, very frustrating. So I sought out the anthropology club here, and I was president of that club for quite a while. And we tried to cultivate a space where we could talk about things without that assumption, and then just talk about them scientifically. It was through that I met so many wonderful people through the Club of Secular Understanding, Billy and Pitzer being integral to those, as well as lots of others. And that's really where I realized that secular studies was what I was consumed with. So I loved anthropology, but I didn't think that physical or cultural anthro were going to do it for me. I really needed to study religiosity, and your religion is, of course, secular studies, you know. And I took a class with Ryan on monotheistic religion. I did, and I learned a lot of things from it. But I think I realized that the philosophy of religion, although interesting, wasn't the right place for me because I really did want to study why people are not religious. And I heard about the secular studies program with Phil here and at Pitzer, and I was intrigued, and I applied, and I was going to do anthro and secular studies together, and then I realized that sociology was a better fit because the coursework more closely aligns with secular studies. I definitely intend to study secularism and secularity outside of, or moving forward with my academic career, but I know that I won't be majoring past my bachelor's in secular studies because it doesn't really exist, at least not locally. So I'll be doing sociology and hopefully going all the way up through that, and I'd like to teach it someday. But it's always going to be a really, really important part of my studies because I'm not religious, and I've realized that other people are not religious, and so I really want to know why and how it works and how it influences people's lives.
Thank you. All right, so we've got a little smattering of each of their positions. So who would like to be brave and ask the first question?
Okay, I have a few things to say.
No questions?
So I'll just have you sit down.
I do have a question. I will lead up to a question, I promise. So, first I want to say about the atheist booths, which you do a lot for. You do everything you can to make sure that
make awesome science.
You make awesome science.
Yes, you make these science.
And the main goal is you're right. We're to break the negative stereotypes that atheists have, and we're there to be asked. We're not there to ask questions, which I really try to stress to the atheists there, that we're not there to debate anybody. We're there to break negative stereotypes. We're there to be asked. That's why it's called Asking Atheists, not attack a Christian or attack a Muslim. This is to be asked. So we're putting ourselves there in the forefront to be asked. And we do get the people who are really negative, and we do get the people who are listening, and they end up coming to club, and then they really like it, and they're like, I didn't realize I was a secularist, So it's a great booth if you guys want to stop by. It's every other Wednesday. Quad at 12:30. Also with Ryan, I wanted to also make clear that you can be religious and be a secularist because it actually benefits religious people because we're not. It's equal weight. We don't want governments coming into churches telling you how and when you should worship, just like we don't want churches going into and telling you how law should be dictated and things like that. Because it's not fair because we're a melting pot of religions. I think secularism really is about fairness. And then Phil, I wanted to also say that you brought up a memory of mine. Just recently, I was in a hospital with my friend who just had a baby, and I stayed there the night, and I woke up to a nurse. It was just like my atheist tingling, I don't know. But I rolled up to it and I was saying, my friend, because they were watching TV and they happened to say that there was a shooting at a school, and she was like, well, people are always asking why there was a shooting at the school, is because they can't take God out of schools. And I started thinking, like, I really want to say something, but this is going to be her nurse, you know, the whole time she's here, so I shouldn't say anything. But I was just like thinking about, like, well, it happens in Christian schools too, and like stuff like that. But I have been asked before, now here's my question. I have been asked before, with all these secular societies, this question for everyone, you know, would you rather live there? Wouldn't it be nice to live in a more secular society? Like, if you had the chance to move to Sweden and all your family can go, would you be able to go? Would you be willing to go? I mean, and my answer to that is no, because I want to be here and fight. Do you know what I mean? I want, like, we're in a really religious country, and I want to be here and, like, you know, being activists with this kind of stuff. And so my question to you is, what are your responses to that? If you could move to a more secular society, would you be willing to move to a more secular society if, you know, all your loved ones can go, like, you know, excluding all that part? But if you could move to a more secular society, would you, versus being here in a more religious society?
You want me to take that? Okay, my first response is, just as there's different types of religions and different religious societies, you know, are we comparing, you know, Thailand could be described as a Buddhist culture. Nepal could be described as a religious country. El Salvador could be described as a religious country. So too could Ireland. I mean, it comes in different shapes and sizes. So too is Saudi Arabia. Now, or Yemen. I mean, you know, so Mali. I mean, so we all know that there's kind of like different types of religious societies. In some cases, religion is mild and just kind of part of the culture in a sweet, kind of non-threatening way. In other cultures, religion is very strong. I mean, there's about, I think 14 countries in the world today, they're all Muslim, where being an atheist merits the death penalty. You can be killed for being an atheist. So that's spooky to me. So it depends. But my point is, we have to remember something similar goes on with secular societies. There's different kinds. The former Soviet Union was a very secular society, and priests and ministers were rounded up and shot, and churches were bulldozed, and you didn't have religious freedom. Albania was the first officially atheist nation ever declared on planet Earth, and it was a dictator, Enver Hoxha, and he made it illegal to name your child any name from the Bible or the Quran. He made it illegal to own a Bible or a Quran. He destroyed all the churches and mosques. I mean, not a pretty picture. So it depends on what secular society you're talking about. So I like to differentiate between the more organically secular societies and then the sort of coercedly secular societies. So former Soviet Union, Albania, North Korea. These are societies where secularism is forced on a captive population. So there's not religious freedom, there's not freedom of speech, freedom of all the other freedoms we take for granted, such as human rights, are not present, and they force a captive, enslaved population to be non-religious. I do not want to move to any of those secular societies. If you're talking about a society that is organically secular, and by that I mean people just lose interest in religion naturally, no one's forcing it on them, they just lose interest in religion, they kind of lose belief in God calmly, no one's forcing it upon them naturally, they just opt out of church for no reason. I find living in those societies wonderful because, frankly, it's very difficult for me to live around people who believe things that I find so grossly untrue. It really is. It's kind of freaky to me. Like, and if you consider that a put down, I don't know, I would think it's just the same for you. If you're a strong religious believer, you must find atheists like me freaky as well. I mean, how can you not believe in a creator? What, do you think this is all an accident? Where do you get your morals? I mean, it must be just as weird. So I think it works both ways. But to me, I so enjoyed living in Scandinavia where there was just a basic, I mean, people laughed at me. I remember I was doing interviews. This is a typical experience. And I would start the interview, trying to get a sense of their religious background, their parents, and then I'd start asking their beliefs. And I'd say, so you're, do you believe in like Adam and Eve? And and they would be like, what? And I'd be like, well, I'm just trying to get a sense of like, you know, where you fall and the kind of, so do you believe that Adam and Eve really existed? And people looked at me like, well, nobody believed. Why are you asking me that? And I had one guy kind of say, are you for real? And he goes, and this man was in his 60s, I believe. He said, I've never met a single person who thinks Adam and Eve were real. We all know that's a myth. And I said, well, back in California, my neighbors believe it, my school principal believes it, the people on my city council believe it, my president believes it, the pizza guy believes it, like, you know, so I found it really refreshing to live in a society where, and I still to this day prefer to live, I don't think I could live in the Bible Belt. I don't think I could, I've heard so many, I've interviewed so many people from Alabama, Arkansas, Mississippi, and it's terrifying to me, the stories that they have to endure. So I would definitely prefer to live in a more secular society, and I would be terrified to live in a theocracy. I mean, that would be frightening. And the horror stories of people that live in, I mean, what? Just, what was it, 2 days ago, a professor in Pakistan was murdered for being, just even questioning certain aspects of the Quran. I mean, that's terrifying to me. And we need to fight that.
Thank you. Patrick.
This question is for Professor Zuckerman. Why do you believe that the United States is so much more dogmatically religious than the rest of the Western world?
Oh, man. I have that all written somewhere. And I give that lecture at least once a year. So I'll go really quickly, and then I'll let my co-panelists jump in. Why is the United States so much more religious? You call it dogmatic religious than, let's compare it to other Western democracies, because it doesn't really work to compare us to Qatar or, you know, so if we look at other Western industrialized democracies, we are indeed the most religious and the most fundamentalist, if you will, or dogmatic. So the question is why? Let me go quickly, and I don't know which is more significant, so I'm not doing this in a priority way. I'm just off the top of my head. Ready? Number one, the earliest white European settlers to this nation were religious Christian fanatic fundamentalists who were hell-bent on creating a theocracy. They left England because they thought it wasn't Christian enough. I mean, they were killing Quakers in the early colonies. Quakers, right? So, so we have that kind of historical background. Number two, we have the greatest levels of poverty of any Western industrialization. We're the only Western industrialized democracy that doesn't provide universal health care for its citizens. We have the highest gap, the largest gap between rich and poor of any Western industrialization. Most people live paycheck to paycheck. We have the highest crime rates, the highest murder rates by far. So life is a lot scarier and more insecure here in the United States, so people turn to religion for comfort in those trying times. Number three, we have extreme racial and ethnic and cultural diversity, and people move around a lot. So to feel a sense of belonging in the United States can be tricky if the average American family moves every 5 years, and we speak a lot of different languages, we come from a lot of different countries, we have a lot of different backgrounds, so religion tends to be a major provider of if you want a place to belong and feel comfortable when you move to town and you're new, you go to the church and boom, you've got instant community. Number four, this thing called the First Amendment, which separated church and state, so there could be no established religion in this country. So what that meant is all religions have to support themselves. There's no taxes supporting religion, or there shouldn't be. There are, that's a whole other issue, because they're tax exempt, so in a sense it's de facto. But there's no, if you want to start a church and have people come to your church, you have to get them to come and donate money. That's the only way you will survive, and pay the rent, and pay the air conditioner, and pay your pastor, which means we've developed a heavily marketed, aggressive, commercialized form of religiosity that aggressively markets on billboards and door-to-door and TV commercials. So religion is much more heavily marketed than in other Western industrialized nations because they're out seeking customers or clients or parishioners or however you want to call it. And number... I can't remember the last one, was it? I can't remember. I think those are off the top of my head. Those, and I guess finally I would just add that in the face of Soviet atheism, we decided to define ourselves, and I'm glad we defined it. I don't like Soviet communist, Stalinist hell. That was a nightmare. People were harmed and tortured and destroyed. My own family, some were behind the Iron Curtain. And my grandma's brother had a horrific tale of arrest and torture in communist what was then the Czechoslovakia. So I have no problem with the United States defining ourselves against Soviet communism in terms of freedoms and liberties, but what we ended up doing was saying, oh, if the communists are atheists, then we must be God's favorite. We must be God's country. And that's when Under God got inserted into the Pledge of Allegiance. That's what's so funny when people say, like the nurse at the hospital, like, when we took God out of schools, I'm just like, we put God in 1954. We added God every morning to the Pledge of Allegiance. He should be very happy. He should be like stopping all those bullets with his invisible hand as they get shot from the shotguns. So the notion that, so what happened, I think, in the United States since the 1940s and more of the 50s onward for the next few decades is this welding of Americanness, meaning God-loving and God-fearing. It got really welded. So those would be my best answers. Anybody want to add?
I know moving on, I just want to add, yeah, for me that nationalism piece is really interesting, and I'm teaching this Holocaust course this semester in this room, by the way, tomorrow at 2 p.m. if you want to come by. And focusing on the rise of German nationalism, and I'm starting to see these parallels in a way that I hadn't before between the way in which religious and other social ideologies kind of meld together into a national ideology. So I think America, through the Cold War and other parts of our 20th century experience, became very much intertwined with the conservative religiosity. And in some ways, yeah, the history goes all the way back to our colonialist, there's all sorts of other pieces there. But the nationalism piece is particularly interesting to me right now, and I can say more, but I told her I would, so. But check it out.
Yes. Christina.
Okay. So I have a question for Professor Zuckerman, but the last question won't be for the entire panel. Because you mentioned organically secular countries, and I was just wondering whether you noticed a pattern in that development, whether all the countries had a similar route into secularism, or whether they differed substantially. And if so, do you think America could ever possibly become a secular country? And that last question would be for all of them.
So I'll be really quick because I don't want to talk too much. Different countries all have their different historical idiosyncrasies and cultural and demographic idiosyncrasies, so it's very difficult. I mean, we're seeing an uptick of secularism, for example, right now in Jamaica. What is spurring that is different than what caused secularization in Japan over the last 75 years, which is different what has caused Vermont to be so irreligious. I mean, wherever you go in the world, Brazil is seeing that for the first time, 8% of Brazilians are saying they're not religious. I mean, this is 8% seems like nothing. I mean, Brazil is a massive country, so 8% of Brazilians say they're not religious. This is a big deal. So what causes secularization in different societies is always unique to those cultures. But if we had to make a general rule, we'd say the following as sociologists. When societies become more stable, prosperous, and peaceful, and not prosperous just for the 1%, but when wealth is greatly shared. So when a society is able to meet the challenges for survival, when people have health care and places to live and access to jobs, and there's a stable democratic government, that's when we tend to see religion start to go down. That's pretty common across the board. Number two, when people get more educated, we see that tends to have a deleterious effect on religious beliefs, at least fundamentalist religious beliefs. So when you get strong, healthy democracies that are prosperous, egalitarian, religion starts to go down. When you see educational attainment in a society, religion tends to go down or gets a little bit watered down. And number three, when women begin to work outside the home in great numbers, we start to see religiosity go down. So my answer to your last question is absolutely secularity is possible here in the United States if we can reduce the gap between rich and poor, if we can address our social ills, and if we can get a better educated population, and if more women work outside of them.
And just a quick little tiny tidbit. Because you were saying how once you're, like, the first point you made was like prosperous, safety, and like more equality for all the citizens, and then religion starts to kind of deteriorate. Does that mean, because with your studies you found the correlation between the secular community and a more prosperous one, could it be that the prosperity is what's causing it rather than the other way around?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You bet. If I had to make bets. But it also, we see it both ways. So for example, to me, a necessary condition for a secular society is the end of theocracy. We have to have rule by people, democracy, rather than rule by God, or God's representatives on earth. That was an ideological shift. That break of saying, no, government by the consent of the governed, not government by divine right of kings, was the start of it all. And that was ideological. That was secular people, or actually deists and other Christians or whatever, but whoever spearheaded it set the stage in motion for separating. So there are some times in which just pure secular ideology can also have an effect. But if I had to place bets, I would say in a sort of historical materialist framework that, yeah, these things in society have to shift first, and then people's religiosity will win.
I just wanted to say something about the it happening organically. I think that we already ideally have a society that is secular, but it's not. So functionally, and so I think that the fact that there's several states where it's illegal to hold public office if you're an atheist, to me seems pretty unconstitutional. And so I would say I think it's good for things to happen organically, and I wouldn't want to force people to be atheists, but I think that those sorts of things need to change, and that maybe you can't be just organic about it. Like, I think you might need to advocate a little bit in those ways. Not that I'm disagreeing with you, but so when you see things like that, like where city councils do prayer for every, and they don't, and now they've started to do more secular invocations, but there's prayer at every city council meeting. There's God on our dollar bills. There's there's examples of it all over. I think that in that way, I think you have to advocate for those changes because it's just not fair. And it's not fair to other people of other religions, and it's not fair to non-believers. So it's not just about atheists, it's about anybody that believes anything differently than Christianity. So
I just want to add briefly as well that I think activism is important because although there's a rise in secularity, we can see that there is also a rise of the Christian right for the last 30, 40 years, I guess. I'm terrible at math. So anyway, I think that it's also important to understand that we have a very unique thing going on here where we not only privilege religion to a very heavy extent, but we also privilege corporations, and a lot of Christian conservatives have a leg up, I think, in that area as well, where we have just recently allowed corporations to express religious identity, which I think is harmful, and that's going to be an extra push that we have to make if we're going to either move toward more secular nation.
I guess I'll jump in. I have a lot to say, man. I want to answer all those questions, so I'm trying to keep it all together. Really quickly to Billy's comment about the religionists or people who are religious being secular. I completely agree, and I was sort of trying to say as much, right? That it depends on what you mean by secularization. If you mean by secularization, secularism, a separation of powers, a church and state, absolutely. In fact, many of you know, many of the most vocal advocates for it were actually conservative religious groups. The Baptists really pushed for it, allied with Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, really pushed for secularization, but it's for religious reasons, but still bought into this broader idea of the need for freedom of conscience and these other freedoms that would be impinged upon or imposed upon by an official, state church and that sort of thing. So I think not only can they are, and still many of the major Baptist, other mainline denominations support secularization at that level. I was actually just reading something that the largest Baptist organization besides Southern Baptist still is vehemently pro-secularization, right? So it's not that, there's no conflict there, but then secularization in terms of, pushing non-religious, as they're perceived to be, anyway, non-religious social issues and that sort of thing, that's where it can get messy, right? Where you get this dual identity that gets pushed, and you're like, well, I believe in separation of church and state, but then I don't necessarily want there to be greater secularity amongst the general public, or you want to see social institutions still reinforced implicitly by religion, prayer in schools type stuff, and so some might support the general idea of this separation of powers, but then want to hold on to those things, and it just gets messy. So in answer to the last question, really good question, by the way. I think it's tough. I actually am not that hopeful for America moving that direction. And I'll tell you why. So I shared actually virtually all. We do have a holdout, Bible Belt and SoCal. We live in a very interesting place in the country, and we live in a very interesting country. And Phil already alluded to the religious history we have, very unique. The current religious climate, unique. It's really polarized, really balkanized. You have. I was just looking online at the books on secularization, and you see them both ways. Like Newt Gingrich, and the subtitle of his last book was "Stopping Obama's Secular Socialist Machine." So I think that there's,
if only.
I know. There's irony there abounding, but that's the way it's viewed, right? That even that's what secularism really is, or that Obama's a secularist, not by a long stretch of the imagination. But anyway, that said, I think it'd be tough, and I think the disentangling of institutions from their religiosity and from people's commitment to them as being religious, I think is tough. I also think that, unlike some of these other countries, and some have had really troubled and complicated warring and colonial past, but I think for the most part, the more organically atheistic countries were able to chart that course in a more linear fashion, right? That they're able to move from pretty religious to kind of more culturally religious to really not that religious to kind of right? Those kind of Danes in the interviews. I don't see that being quite as possible with American history for several reasons. One, we're not as homogenous socially, culturally, religiously, ethnically, in every demographic you can imagine, right? I think not all the organic atheistic countries are that, but that's one common feature of many of them, right? Ours is very mixed. Getting back to the history of slavery or even recent immigration issues, we just have a very diverse group to work with that makes some of these social inequities difficult to tackle. And I think, I'm all for increasing these social welfare programs and other things that can begin to mitigate those differences and have common cause. I don't see it happening very, very soon. The other, relating to our place in the world, right? So I think you see this in even many Muslim countries, and that's one of my areas of interest and study. But many of them, the mid-20th century, became very secular, right? They're post-colonial identities. So you have countries in North Africa, you have Iran, right? In the middle of Iran, it was illegal to wear hijab in the middle of the century. Right now it's illegal to not wear it in certain areas. So I think, we're actually more similar to those countries than I wish we were. That there's a lot of instability related to our place in the world, to geopolitics. And so I see this backlash, this pendulum swing happening much more regularly in American culture. And that's why you have the rise of religious right several times in the 20th century. And we're in one of the most vehement uprisings currently, right? In response to instability in the world, our, this alleged Islamic threat, all these, whether they're myths or realities, I think we see our place in the world as one of being this last bastion of faith and liberty and these sorts of things. And again, whether myth or reality, I think those ideologies get coupled with this religious identity and this nationalism that I mentioned earlier. And I think it's hard, almost like we'd have to have a different course in the 21st century than we've had in the 20th century, 19th and 18th and 17th for that matter. And that, it's sort of like saying, can America become this utopia and without erasing the past? I don't know. We all have this, whatever, Men in Black, like memory sticker. Okay, how should we get along? Okay, let's bond our humanity. And we start, organically cultivating that. I think it's possible. I just don't see that happening unless American history was much different. Now, in the long run, sure, we're talking 500 years or something, maybe. But the idea that we could chart a course similar to certain Central European and Western European countries and so forth, I don't think so.
Well, and that's why for that
not
reason.
Now.
Well, and for that reason, I think that's why we have to advocate for change and to separate those things are separate, because it can do real harm when you have people who are making policy based around a religion. That could do real measurable harm to people. Let's say you don't want women to be covered for their health care. Like their uteruses are not part of their bodies because religion. And so that sort of worries me, and I think that there can be real harm there. When we want to prevent gay people from getting married or whatever it is, I don't think we need to be legislating one religious belief, and I think that does happen. So I know there's a explicit movement for politicians to get into office so that they can legislate religious beliefs, and that really worries me. Especially given that things aren't going to organically change probably.
Okay, let's take another question, and then we'll get
A fake vote.
Yeah.
This question, and I'm going to build up to the question a little bit, and I hope this doesn't seem like too much of a procedural bit. I would like every panelist to answer this question, and I would very much like to hear all of your takes on it. As you all know, I hold you in very high esteem, and as the secretary of the Secular Club, thank you so much for coming out tonight. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. And, I have something very troubling to relate to the crowd and to you, and that is that, just briefly, I'm a criminal justice major. My focus is investigation of crimes against children. And in Arizona, there's a faith-based initiative, and you may have heard of it. It's called Project Rose, and they work in conjunction with the local law enforcement there. And essentially, the procedure is this. The police will pick up a street prostitute. This is an arrest by a rose by any other name is a rose, and this is an arrest by any other name. But it's legally deemed detention. So they're taken in handcuffs, and they're brought to Bethany Bible Church, where they are forced to talk to a team of prosecutors, detectives, and representatives of this faith-based program. And they're given a choice. And the choice is diversion or jail. The choice is a faith-based diversion program or jail. Or prison, depending on whether or not they have priors. And I find this completely and utterly reprehensible as someone who's closely studied criminologically the phenomenon of human trafficking and the structure of street prostitution, and as someone who's seen it personally and witnessed it personally in my upbringing in San Bernardino. I cannot tell you how much this enrages me, not only in the sense that we are doing severe injustice to victims of prostitution and victims of human trafficking, but also that there is this massive religious overstepping, this massive religious overreach that is blatantly unconstitutional. And what I guess the question, and I want to throw that example out there because the question that I have for the panel is this. In a secular context, what does it mean to pursue or secure justice? Does this rely more on constitutional values, would you say? Or is there a way that incorporates that, but I guess runs with it even further? And grab it.
Miss Eklund? Oh.
No, I called out.
Yeah. Okay, I thought it was a good It is a good question, and I think that we have to be really careful when we talk about secularity and like moving forward and how we're going to like not implement secular things, but like try to keep religion out as much as possible out of government. Unfortunately, I don't think it necessarily means that we're going to act any better as a nation. So even if we do resist certain policies that favor religion in some way, I don't think that that's where the change is really going to come from. For how we manage justice and how we manage human rights and how we fight for those things. I think that has to come from the people wanting to really improve those parts. And I think a lot of it is education, a lot of it is economics, helping areas. But there is a religious problem because if we look at the poverty issues and things like that, they're more located in the South where it's very religious. I think that justice is something that's going to be partly separate from religious, though.
Well, I just have a problem with that because it's coercion. And so I think that I have a problem with someone being coerced into being secular or coerced into being a certain religion, and that's really constraining them to go into the diversion program when there's no other alternative. The alternative is worse, is jail. And so that's my main problem with that. I don't think it has a role in the justice system. So.
Thank you.
Agreed. I mean, I share, I guess, your outrage and your concern, all your concerns. Yeah, I think, that's precisely an issue that secularization or secularism as a theory is the political aspect of it directly addresses, right? That this idea that there should never be any coercion or any forced participation in religious activity and that sort of thing. And, it's sort of an impossible choice, right? It's not, I was going to say Sophie's choice, and that would probably denigrate the gravity of the original Sophie's choice, but that is, right, go to jail or engage in this faith-based program. And as you know, there's some of those in juvenile intervention and these boot camps and stuff that in particular counties or particular agencies, the only option is either a religious boot camp or you go to jail. It's like, wow, right? So that's one area where I think that, it's unconstitutional. I think there just needs to be a greater legal, addressing of that. Now, that said, the second part, I'm not too sure exactly where you're going, but I think, I think our legal system as it stands is sufficient to deal with most of those things. I think we just need to be more aggressive about addressing those concerns. I don't know exactly where you're going with that. I don't think we need a religious framework, a religious sense of justice, or whatever to deal with any of those issues. I think there are many secular frameworks. It's actually what I'm working on. The project in Zurich is kind of actually models for addressing issues in within secular systems. Yeah, there's many ways of doing that. Whether it's, and I don't need to get into ethical theory here, but I mean there's many just legal avenues, pragmatic avenues, utilitarian ones. There are many ways of dealing with those things, and so. I guess my concern is really on the other end that the way in which religious institutions understand some of these concepts actually cut against the legal and maybe more pragmatic ways of understanding. So justice, at least in some of this context, is understood sort of cosmologically and eternally and those sorts of things, and I think that actually works against advancing those things in this world, right? So I mentioned the term before, and I'll say it again, but I sort of see the issue from my perspective, and that is secularity or secularism as I see it just really wants to horizontalize most things that go on in human experience, right? That is this worldly, our institutions, our social structure, our community actions, our moral motivations for living should be humanistic, right? And in that sense, secular. We're not appealing to divinities or appealing to religious structures to do so. And so I think that's something that can be done and should be done. I don't know exactly where I was going with the religious piece, but I think often religion can work against that in verticalizing that. These ideas of redemption, eternalizing some of these categories of justice and repentance and whatever, and that can get in the way. So So I think you're onto that. There's something amiss there.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, I want to hear your take on it as well. I bring it up because your ethical worth is often tied primarily to whether or not you believe. And I'm sure, as you recall, about an hour and 45 minutes ago, we were told by someone, I won't say who, this person flat out said, I don't believe that anyone's an ethical person until you take Jesus Christ in your heart. And I think that lends itself to the philosophy that there are people that we need to save from themselves, and somehow, mysteriously, miraculously, I dare say, we have to use the most coercive, I can't imagine anything more coercive than law enforcement force. We must use the most coercive means to do so. I don't think it's that unlike our current scheme of drug policy, for that matter. However, I think this is one example of how that religious ideology lends itself to kind of give a rubber stamp on a degree of coercion that we wouldn't accept for another issue.
I teach in the prison system, so I think there's like a robust religious community in the prison system. And so I think that people find, that can save people. Like they feel like that once they found religion, they were able to get their lives back on track. And so I respect that a lot, and I think that there should be a right to that. I guess the element is the choice that I have a problem with. So I do want to say that I think that there should be space for that if people want that, but it should be sort of less coercive. So.
Agreed. Yeah. I'm not saying that there can't be those sorts of partnerships or options or available programs. Just that they're not. They shouldn't be the only choice. Right? That's the issue.
All right. Can I take another question? We're going to run out of time, and I don't know you so good.
My name's Ross.
And I would rather be calling up before I go.
I'm a professor in Falcioni's class. My question kind of ties to the previous questions. America going secular, and then how our laws are determined. As a republic who determines things democratically, if we are overwhelmingly in numbers of being religious people and our votes all count equally, our religious biases are carried into our vote. So how would a secular nation so heavily dominated by religious citizens actually move to secular legislation?
It's called the Constitution.
It gets back to Chris's comment, right? That we already have that in place. That is, that we shouldn't be able to. Our votes should never be able to violate basic constitutional separation of powers, separation of church and state.
Even if a majority of people, if a majority of Americans say all people should be thrown in prison because that's unconstitutional. That's the whole idea that it's not just majority rules. So that's.
Plus, it's so fragmented too.
Yeah.
So it's not like everyone's just one religion.
Exactly. But what I would say is, I just want to, if I may reiterate, in my talk about organic secularization, that was me just sort of being an observer. Like, Japan has experienced rapid secularization in the last 75 years without a single atheist group in all of Japan. It just doesn't exist, right? Many societies can become secular without activism. But the United States is a unique case, which is why I started by saying, hey, every society has its own unique trajectory. And here in the United States, whether we're talking criminal justice issues, whether we're talking democracy, we most absolutely have to take an active role in defending and pushing our rights and defending our rights and fighting against. And it intersects with everything, whether we're talking stem cell research. Do you want to have a cure for Parkinson's or not? Hey, it's the religious who are against stem cell research. It's the secular who are trying to get it. If you don't like the death penalty, religious people are far, oddly enough, the religion of mercy and forgiveness. Evangelical Christians are far more likely to support the death penalty than secular Americans. If you're against draconian prison punishments, or that evangelical Christians are far more likely to support, throw away the key, forget rehabilitation, let's punish these people, whereas secular Americans are far more likely to support rehabilitation. When they're talking global warming, just straight up global warming. The more religious Americans don't buy it, don't think it's a problem, and the more secular are alarmed and understand the science behind it. So whether we're talking prayer in school or global warming, racism even correlates with how religious or secular people are. So whether it's racism, sexism, homophobia, so all these hot button issues from women's reproductive rights to gay marriage to environmental protections to the death penalty to war on drugs. In that sense, we absolutely, as secular Americans, have to fight together and make our voices heard, and make it so that when politicians are pondering legislation, whether it be about faith-based initiatives and what, they now think, well, what will the religious say about this? If I sign this, is the Bible, you know, the Bible thumpers, is the religious right going to, you know, come up against me? They need to think about, we need to get to be a situation where they think, oh, what will that secular chunk of America think if I sign this legislation? What will those 20 or 30% of Americans who are secular think? And that's when we will see change for the better, I think.
I think, and that's still, it's important to point out, that's still organic, right? It's not that,
right,
the distinction between organic versus authoritarian or top-down, so state-imposed, like what was in China, North Korea, whatever. So it's not that being an activist, advocating for change, working through all the avenues possible for, you know, for secularism and for these sorts of secular causes. It's not that that's not organic, that is organic. That is sort of, it's a grassroots movement of people who have these values and want their voices heard. That's in some ways precisely the definition of organic as I see it, right? It comes from within, it comes from people's concerns and questions with the status of their society and these sorts of, you know, encroachment on freedoms and liberties, and people advocate for those. And in our country, especially given its history, and I'm sort of alluding to that very vaguely, but I think that's the way it'll have to happen. It's going to be a legislative battle in a big way. I think there's also a broader moral awakening that I'm still hoping for. But there'll be kind of a rattling or a shaking of our moral sensibilities, human rights issues, and so forth. And I think that's sort of happening. In fact, that Pew Forum that Phil's mentioned, by the way, I just recommend it just categorically. If you haven't checked out the Pew Forum on religion and public life, it's done in 2012. The data on there is unreal. And you can look by social, you can go state by state, look at maps. It's graphically well displayed. You can look at every sub-demographic, every other measure of religiosity. Yeah, there's articles on that, other data. And just, yeah, mine that, you can start to see what issues are important, what issues need to be worked on, and yeah, a lot there.
Can you guys define secularism?
No. So actually, I prepared some notes. I thought we were going to kind of do a little bit more formal presentation. So that was my first slide. What is secularization? And I gave about 5 definitions. And I think they're all operable. They're all functional in some capacity. I think Billy kind of pointed out this more political notion of a separation of church and state. That a formal separation between the governing powers and the powers of the church. And I think for some, that's what it's been for since the founding of our nation. And in that sense, we're probably all secularists. I mean, I don't know many people that really want a theocracy. I mean, I know students who are like, more parent schools might be a good thing, but I haven't had many who are like, yeah, you should be stoned for adultery. You know what I mean? Like this. There are some. There's probably 2 of you in here. But in general, I don't think those people are pushing for that disintegration of our long-established secularism. Now, again, de facto, we're not really secular, and this is the second issue, right? So secularization, maybe just arguing for, despite the constitutional separation, that sort of thing, arguing for more of, programmatic or disentanglement of religious power and authority with, everyday affairs, whether it's,
I would say social and cultural, too. I don't like my son going to school and being told he's going to hell because he's not, for example. So, because it's so against what the social norm is for him to not believe in hell or God, that that shocks 8-year-olds into telling him he's going into hell, even his best friends. And so like that, so I would say I would want it to lose political, cultural, and social significance in that way, which may be controversial. But that's my personal belief.
And kind of combining some of those, I think there's just the movement, which is what Michelle sort of started with, but just the idea of secular humanism, right? That's kind of a total worldview or ideology. It's sort of like an option amongst the sort of checked boxes you can check for like identity or religious identity. It's often considered a post-religious identity or a non-religious identity. That's still sort of encompassing many things, right? So sort of an ethos, a very humanistic ethos, a more pro-science, advancement attitude, more critical thinking, these sorts of values and perspectives on society, politics that's wrapped into a framework that people can adopt. I think it's kind of an identity issue. So like I'm a secular humanist. I'm not saying I am, but I'm saying someone would say I'm a secular humanist as sort of a way of demarcating themselves, and not necessarily in opposition to religion, but just saying I'm not religious, but I have a whole set of values. I have a whole political and social ideology that I uphold. It's not a surrogate for religion. It's just something else. And for many, even seeing that as a post-religious eventuality is important, right? That's sort of this goal, that you should move from religion as part of the secularization thesis, right? You become more secular, and secular humanism is kind of one option of the embodiment of this post-religious identity. In that sense, I think you can't be a secular humanist and a religionist, because that becomes a non-religious identity. But you can be a humanist Jew or a humanist Christian. I know you've debated him, I think, but that Jacques Berliner Blau, that guy, he's a character. He's a professor at Georgetown, does Jewish civilization stuff. He's written a few books on secularization, including one of the best-selling ones last year. I forget the title of it, but it has like kind of rainbow cover. It looks pretty crazy. You wouldn't know what it was to look at it, but yeah, he talks about this term secularish. He says secularish is just, right, and I think it's crap in some ways, but it captures this idea of the most generic umbrella term for people who have some of these values of secular humanism, but would also include religions. So, broadly more this worldly orientation to life. Want a separation of powers. Want, more critical thinking and less dogmatism, or critical religious authority. And like, if you kind of buy into that, whether you're Muslim, Christian, Jew, Buddhist, Hindu, atheist, like you're secular-ish. And I'm not going to start using that term, I just did right now. But I think there's a term to describe, there should be a term to describe that shared commonality. I find, and especially advising the different religious clubs I have, that I think that matters more than religious identity for some, or at least in terms of determining who you really are, how you really do the world, right? So a secularish Muslim and Christian are going to have more in common than a fundamentalist Christian and a liberal Christian are, right? Even though the same religion, it's like, no, but what are your attitudes towards these bigger issues, social issues, social problems, separation of church and state, that sort of thing. So in some sense, I think that's the weakest definition, but one that I think probably fits the most people. It's not preferred for that reason, but I think kind of the secularish move is one that is a broader net to catch a lot of people. I don't know.
You covered it.
On the subject of kind of a secular activism, and I know it doesn't go hand in hand, but I was curious as to your guys' idea on, I guess, the effectiveness and the morality of like a militant atheist, popular Richard Dawkins or Christopher Hitchens.
That was my dissertation, so yeah, I'll try to be brief, hopefully. That's something I wrote about a bit, and I've kind of transitioned more into this ethics piece. But from my perspective, it serves its place, and it's kind of, to jog people's, psyche or conscience on these issues, and their, especially Hitchens. He's probably my favorite. R.I.P. He passed away a couple years ago, but he was just very vocal and brutally critical of those institutions, and was intentionally, like I saw him at a synagogue right before he died, and he's like swearing and being intense, and part of it's like, this is the worst thing in the world for the face of secularization. The other part of me was like, all right, like he's raising awareness, and he would probably admit that. His goal is to prick people's consciousness about this, or conscience about these ethical issues. And so I can go both ways with it, and I think they serve a vital role in raising awareness. They're all the best, some of you don't know this, but in broadly secular studies, if we can even use this term, they're the best-selling authors. So Richard Dawkins, Dan Dennett, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens have all sold now in the millions, right? To sell like 5,000 books on a socialist issue is a big deal. To sell like 2-point-something million like Dawkins, God Delusion is just unbelievable. So in terms of raising awareness, amazing. Causing debates. Phil's done them, I've done them, debate circuits all over the country and all over the world about these questions. I did one at UCLA called, Can We Have Morality Without Gods? We had the leader of the Marxist Party in America. We had Nancy Murphy, who's a Christian theologian philosopher. I was on their kind of middle ground. And it was great, and that wouldn't have happened without those texts. That said, if that's the face of kind of secularism as people see it, this sort of more militant, or what the term is often used, anti-theism. Right? If you don't know Dawkins, he says, we have a duty to ridicule religious people. Hitchens talks about, we should treat people who believe in God the same way we treat people who believe Elvis is still alive. We should laugh at them, right? And again, I don't think that's a good approach. I don't see, but as a provocateur, to just raise these questions, fine. I think the tragedy is it does turn people off. That's why I made the Ask an Atheist booth for people whose only pop cultural experience of secularism is this secularism via anti-theism. Then it's like, oh, you guys are hostile, you guys hate, Christians, and like most secularists don't. In fact, that's actually fairly rare. Anti-theism as a formal position of secularism is fairly rare. Most secularists tend to have a much broader ethic and be more inclusive, while still critical of the things anti-theists are critical of, but not blaming all religionists or all religions in the process. Sam Harris has kind of softened a little bit with his last book.
I just wanted to add, I don't have the same background as Professors Zuckerman and Falcioni. I'm an English professor, but I was asked to advise the Secular Club, it's been 4 or 5 years now, and my first thing was, don't be obnoxious. Like, I'm not going to advise this club that's obnoxious. And so it's not the same membership, but I, no offense, but found sometimes philosophy classes contained some obnoxious elements and aggressive elements, and I didn't. I think that sort of defeats the purpose. And this, I feel like a it is, there's a lot of misunderstanding and miscommunication between believers and non-believers, and I think sort of the purpose of the club is to open dialogue, and we welcome people of all belief systems, and it's a very open environment where everybody is respected, and I think that's the best way to have a conversation and really move forward. So maybe Hitchens and Dawkins raise awareness, and they sell stuff, and they make people mad, and make people talk about it, which is, I think, has a function. But I also think that ultimately, if you're going to come to some sort of understanding of one another, you can't be so aggressive and obnoxious.
Yeah, the polarization bothers me, right?
Yeah,
Just that you're secular or you're like a fundamentalist.
Yeah.
Like almost everyone's in the middle. Let's
Yeah.
start with that.
Yeah.
Right? And you can learn from each other.
I just want to add really quickly that we just started a Secular Student Alliance, which is supported by a national organization. And we just decided on what we were going to do with our club, and this was at Pitzer College. It's a 5C campus, so it's a 5 college campus. I mean, a club. Anyway, never did we really decide that we were going to be like militant atheists and spread our message all over the campus. You know, and I don't think that any of the clubs, the Club for Secular Understanding certainly isn't like that. Riverside Atheists and Freethinkers isn't like that. I mean, you might have like 1 or 2 individuals, Brent said it's fairly rare, but really it's usually about finding community, because we're usually people who find that we live in a religious majority. We really want to talk to other people and have a place to go where the assumption is not, you know, based on, you know, creator, or that you can't be good without God and such.
We are almost out of time. I'll go ahead and take you in the corner.
I'm kind of curious about some research, particularly on, which there isn't that much on religious atheism. For instance, there are religious congregations that have significant numbers of atheists. Like I've been to one of them, for example, Unitarian Universalist. There's also like UFO religions such as Arminianism are also atheistic religions, and they don't have beliefs in God. Because I'm going by the definition of atheism, meaning lack of belief in God. And of course, there are all sorts of religions that also don't have God as well, like many branches of Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, Jainism, and so even anthropologism. One of your collections, Jack David Eller actually mentioned something about anthropologically that atheism is the most prominent form of religion. Whereas like theism, it has been popularized, but it's not necessarily like the most popular form in terms of tribe. So I'm kind of curious about religious expression and religious appreciation by atheists themselves. For example, even in Scandinavia, 48% of atheists are still members of the church, and they also willfully pay taxes to the church because it becomes a fundamental cultural foundation, I guess. It has its cultural uses, just like everyone here. It has cultural uses for the government, even though they're not really fans of it all the time. So that's my question. Any comments on religious atheism and appreciation of religion by atheists themselves? It doesn't have to be militant, of course.
Yeah, it's tricky. I'm not quite sure I know what you're asking.
Well, I mean, that there are people who are part of religious congregations, because there's different dimensions to religiosity. There's belief, belonging, behavior. So religiosity need not be defined strictly by belief.
Absolutely.
It seems like everybody seems to focus on belief as if it's a marker of religiosity. But there's other dimensions as well. I myself used to be an atheist and used to go to religious congregations that had atheists. So, but I don't really hear anybody really talking about
I guess I would just say that you're absolutely right. There's many ways of expressing religion and being religious. There's ritualistic aspects, community aspects, experiential aspects, intellectual aspects, and faith or belief is just one. And in some cultures, it's very low on the totem pole. Among Orthodox Jews, what you believe is less important, really, than just following the mitzvot. I mean, I hung out for my dissertation with fundamentalist Orthodox Jews for over a year. No one ever asked me what I believed. They didn't care. As long as I, didn't eat cheeseburgers, I was good, So, as long as I came out of a Jewish mother, I was fine, and what I believed didn't matter at all. However, in grad school, I had a fellow grad student, Lynn Isaacson, who was studying Christian fundamentalists. And every single time she went to interview someone, the end of the interview was always, wait a minute now, Lynn, are you good with Jesus? Let's get on our knees and pray. I mean, what she believed was so important. So yeah, we're happy to have this sociological interview, blah, 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 blah. But then it was like, now let's talk. Have you accepted Jesus Christ as your personal Savior? I use this anecdote to say secularity is always a mirror, not a mirror, but it's always dancing with the type of religiosity it finds itself at the prom with. So if the prom you're at is all about ritual behavior, then secularity is going to have a very different vibe, as the case in Japan. Japanese secularism doesn't look anything like Irish secularism, right? Irish secularism is about being against the Catholic Church, is getting the Catholic Church out of our schools and away from our kids and stop, regulating them. Secularism in Israel is very different. Israeli secularists want to be able to have stores open on the Sabbath. They want to be able to have a marriage that's not officiated by an Orthodox rabbi. So what I would say is the reason we focus on belief is because this country is predominantly Christian. And a certain kind of Christian, Protestant Christian. So the history of Protestant Christianity had to do with get rid of the ritual, get rid of the liturgy. It's all about faith. It's what Calvin taught. It's what these early Presbyterians and early Congregationalists, and it was about faith and Scripture and getting right with God. So that's the dominant default. So the gold standard of religion for us becomes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But what I would say to piggyback on this, if I may, getting back to the question about aggressive, in-your-face, critical atheism, what I think we have to understand is, how can I say this? We evolved as pack animals. We are a tribal species, as it were, just like other primates. And our tribe, our group, our people is viscerally important to us. However that's defined, and it gets defined in many different ways. My experience is that most people, when you attack their religion, they're not listening to the ideas. They are feeling like you are attacking their race, or their ethnicity, or their family, or their grandparents, or it's about their community. So I find that that's what kicks in at the gut level. They are hearing like I'm attacking their people. Not like, let's have a strictly cognitive conversation about how absurd the notion is that, God, there was a Garden of Eden. It says, whoa, you're putting down my identity. So if we ever want to get any headway, we have to first understand that I think that's most people's reaction. It's a defensiveness that isn't about the ideas. It may play itself out in that arena, but what's really kicking in is a kind of defensiveness about my family, my people, my culture, my race, my ethnicity, my hometown, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So in that sense, I think that in-your-face atheism is problematic, but it has its place. I know a lot of people that love those books and lost their faith from it. So.
Thank you very much. Let's give them all a round. So they may or may not be willing to answer another question from you on the way out, but before we dismiss as a group, I want to remind you that the Chaffey Review is accepting submissions on the subject of countercultures. So if you have a true story about secularism or anything else that you deem counterculture, please submit before October 15th, and there are many students in the audience who can help you out with that. They have flyers, they'll give them to you, and we would love to have your input on this subject, panelists included. Yeah. Thank you again. Thank you for coming out tonight.